Black smoke rolled out from under a shed door. A man coughed inside hard, then went quiet. A boot kicked against the wood from the other side, once, twice, weaker each time. Flames licked up the back wall. A dog barked and clawed at the dirt, spinning in circles. Then a hose hit the ground with a slap. A door flew open. Heat blasted out of the doorway and knocked her back a step. But she went in anyway, low, one arm over her face. Her hands found a boot, then a leg, then 240 pounds of dead weight. She pulled. That woman was Delia Voss, a motel maid who weighed barely half of what she was dragging. Nobody knew the man she saved would bring 40 Hell's Angels to that dusty lot by morning. What did she just walk into? Stay with me on this one. Let me take you back a few hours, because you need to understand who this woman was before that shed caught fire. The Dry Fork Motel sat about 12 miles outside Barstow, right where the desert stops pretending it wants you there. 14 rooms. A cracked pool nobody had filled in years. A neon sign missing half its letters, so at night it just said Dry FOR, which the truckers thought was hilarious. It was the kind of place people stopped at when they'd run out of better options. Half the guests never gave a real name. The other half you wished hadn't. Delia Voss cleaned every one of those 14 rooms, 6 days a week, for $9 an hour. She was 51 years old. Small. Quiet. The kind of woman who apologized when other people bumped into her. She wore the same faded gray uniform every day, kept her hair pinned back, and moved through that motel like she was trying not to leave footprints. Believe me, she'd learned to be invisible on purpose. Life had taught her that being noticed usually meant being blamed. She'd had a husband once. He was gone now, the way a lot of men in that part of the country end up gone. Too much drink, too much road one bad night. She didn't talk about it. She just worked. She was at that motel before the sun came up, and she was there after it went down. And in between, she scrubbed toilets that strangers had ruined and made beds that strangers would ruin again. And she never once complained where anybody could hear. Now here's the thing about the Dry Fork Motel. It was owned by an old man named Walt Kessner, who spent most of his days in Bakersfield seeing doctors. So the real boss, the one who strutted around the lot like he owned the sun, was Walt's son. His name was Cody. 28 years old. And he was the kind of man who treats other people like furniture. Cody Kessner wore designer sunglasses he couldn't afford and drove a lifted truck his daddy paid for. He called Delia the help to her face. Not her name. Just the help. When guests complained about anything, a stain, a smell, a dripping faucet, he'd point at her and say, "Talk to the help, she's slow but she's cheap." And Delia would just nod and say, "I'll take care of it, sir." I want you to sit with that for a second. She wasn't slow. She did the work of 3 people in that heat. But it was easier for Cody to blame her than to fix a thing, and she'd learned that the fastest way through a bad man is to give him nothing to push against. So she gave him nothing. She nodded. She took care of it. And every day, a little more of her went quiet. That afternoon, the day everything changed, it was 106 degrees in the shade. Delia was carrying a stack of towels across the lot when Cody came out of the office with a soda in his hand. "Hey," he called out. Room 9 says their AC's broke again. You touch it. No, sir. I don't touch the units. You told me not to. He took a long sip, watching her over his sunglasses. Then he threw the half-full soda can right at her feet. It burst on the pavement and splashed sticky brown across her white sneakers. Clean that up, he said, and walked back inside laughing. Delia stood there for a second. Just a second. Then she set the towels down and got the mop. She didn't say a word. What was there to say? She'd cleaned up worse. She'd clean up worse tomorrow. Now, I want you to remember that moment. Remember how small this woman made herself. Because in about 2 hours, she was going to do something that nobody in that lot thought she had in her. Not Cody. Not the guests who watched through their curtains. Not even Delia herself. There was one guest at the motel that week who was different. Room 14. The last room, tucked around the back near the tool shed. A big man had checked in 3 days earlier, paid cash for a week, and mostly kept to himself. He rode a motorcycle. A big black one, chrome-worn from real miles. He had a German shepherd that went everywhere with him, a huge dog with one torn ear who sat outside the room like a statue and watched everything. The man was maybe 60, gray in his beard, arms like a man who'd worked with them his whole life. He had tattoos crawling up from his collar, but he was polite. Said please. Said thank you. He left his towels folded on the bed instead of on the floor, which no guest at the Dry Fork had done in the whole time Delia had worked there. Cody hated him on sight. Greasy drifter. Cody called him. Probably can't read. He'd complained twice about the dog, and once about the motorcycle leaking oil on his precious lot. But the man had paid cash, and Walt's rule was you don't turn away cash. So the big man stayed. Delia had spoken to him exactly once. She'd been cleaning the room next door, and the dog had growled at her. The man had come out and said, "Diesel." Easy. Then he looked at Delia and said, "He won't hurt you, ma'am. He just don't know you yet." And he'd smiled. A real smile. She'd said thank you and hurried off. But she remembered it. A man had called her ma'am. It had been a long time. That night she'd lain awake thinking about it. That single small word, the way another person might think about a compliment or a kiss. That's how far down the world had pushed her. A stranger's basic decency felt like a gift she didn't know what to do with. Nobody at that motel knew who he really was. Not Cody. Not Delia. They just saw an old biker with a mean-looking dog. They had no idea what that leather vest hanging in room 14 actually meant, or what it would summon. By late afternoon, the heat had everyone hiding indoors. Delia was pushing her cart back toward the supply closet when she smelled it. Smoke. Not cigarette smoke. Real smoke, black and oily. She looked toward the back of the lot, and there it was. The tool shed. Gray smoke pouring out from under the door and through the gaps in the boards. And then she heard the dog. Diesel going insane, barking and slamming himself against the shed door. Delia dropped everything and ran toward it, and that is where our story truly begins. She got to the shed, and the heat coming off the door was unreal. Diesel spun toward her, barking, then threw himself back at the door, and she understood. There was someone inside. "Hello," she yelled. "Is somebody in there?" A cough answered her. Weak. Low to the ground. Delia grabbed the door handle and yanked her hand back. Burning hot. She screamed for help. She screamed toward the office, toward the rooms, toward anyone. Room 9's curtain moved. She saw it move. A face looked out, then the curtain fell shut again. It was 106 degrees, and everybody was inside with their doors shut and their AC units roaring, and not one of them wanted the trouble. Nobody came. So she did the only thing she could think of. She saw the green garden hose coiled by the office wall, 50 feet of it, and she ran for it, cranked the spigot, and dragged that hose all the way across the lot, the whole length of it, water already soaking her uniform. She aimed it at the door and the base of it, and turned the door dark and wet. Then she wrapped her hand in the wet hem of her shirt and grabbed the handle again. She kicked the door. Once. Twice. On the third kick it swung in, and a wall of heat and smoke rolled over her. Now, most people would have stopped right there. Any sane person would have. The whole back half of that shed was on fire, cans of paint thinner and oil cooking on the shelves, and the smoke was so thick she couldn't see her own hands. There's a moment in a fire where your body simply refuses. Every animal instinct you've got tells you to turn around and run, and it is very hard to argue with. Delia stood in that doorway, and every part of her screamed to leave. But down low, near the floor, she saw a boot. Delia got on her knees and crawled in. The smoke was less down there, but not much. She found the boot, followed it up to a leg, and there he was. The big man from room 14. Face down, not moving. He must have gone in for something, and gotten overcome by the fumes before he even knew. She grabbed the collar of his vest and pulled. Nothing. The man was enormous. She got both hands under his arm and pulled again, digging her heels into the concrete, and he slid maybe an inch. 1 inch. That was all 51 years, and 110 pounds could buy her. And there were 15 feet between that body and the door. Behind her, Diesel was barking at the doorway, and she used the sound like a compass. She pulled toward the barking. Inch by inch. Her lungs were screaming. Her eyes were pouring. Something popped and burst behind her, and she felt heat sear across her back. She smelled her own hair singeing, and she kept pulling anyway, because she'd already decided, somewhere down in a place she didn't have words for, that she was not going to be one more person who watched through a curtain. She pulled. She pulled again. And somewhere in there, she stopped thinking about how big he was and how small she was, and there was just the pulling. Just the next inch. Just the barking up ahead in the smoke. The last stretch. She got a foot against the door frame and shoved backward with everything she had, and the two of them tumbled out into the dirt together. She kept crawling, dragging him, until they were well clear, and then she rolled him onto his back and did the only first aid she knew, pressing on his chest, tilting his head, begging him to breathe. He wasn't breathing. "Come on," she said. "Come on, don't you do this." She pressed on his chest again, and Diesel pushed his nose against the man's face and whined. And then he coughed. A huge, wet, tearing cough. He rolled to his side and threw up black and gasped in a breath that sounded like a man clawing his way out of a grave. He was alive. That's when the office door finally opened, and Cody came out to see what all the noise was about. By then half the shed was gone, black smoke climbing into the desert sky. Delia was sitting in the dirt, soaked, filthy, coughing, one arm still around the big man's shoulders. Diesel stood over both of them, growling at anyone who got close. The fire truck came out from Barstow eventually and put down what was left of the shed. The paramedics loaded the big man onto a stretcher. One of them looked at Delia and said, "Ma'am, you shouldn't have gone in there. But if you hadn't, he'd be dead. You know that, right?" Delia just nodded. She was shaking. The big man reached out from the stretcher as they lifted him and caught her wrist. His voice was wrecked, barely a whisper. "What's your name?" "Delia," she said. "Delia." He nodded slow, like he was filing it away somewhere important. "I won't forget it." Then they drove him away, and Diesel jumped right into the ambulance after him, and nobody argued. Now here's where you'd think the story ends. Woman saves man. Hero of the day. But that's not how it went. Cody walked over, looked at the smoking ruin of his father's shed, and his face went red. "Are you kidding me? Look at this. Look at my shed." Delia looked up at him. There was a man inside. He'd have died. Some greasy drifter. You burned down a shed for that. Cody shook his head. "That's coming out of your pay. All of it. You hear me? And don't think I won't tell my dad you left a spigot running and flooded the lot too." A couple of the other guests had come out by now, and instead of helping, a couple of them laughed. "Little Maid playing hero," one of them said. "Should have let the old buzzard cook." Delia didn't argue. She never argued. She got up, wrung out her shirt, and started coiling the hose back up with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. That night she drove home to her little rented room, sat on the edge of her bed, and cried, quiet, the way she did everything. Her back was blistered. Her lungs ached. She'd saved a man's life and lost a week's pay for it, and everybody had laughed. She looked at her hands under the lamp, the raw places on her palms where the concrete had scraped them bloody, and she thought, not with anger, just with a kind of tiredness, that this was probably how it would always be. You give everything you have, and the world docks your pay for it. She figured that was that. She figured she'd never see the big man again, and tomorrow she'd go back to cleaning rooms and being invisible. She was wrong, because she had no idea what she'd saved. And by sunrise, everything was going to change. The next morning came in hot and still, the way desert mornings do. Delia was back at the Dry Fork by 7, scrubbing room 6, her back wrapped in gauze under her uniform, moving slow. Cody was in the office with his boots up on the desk, scrolling his phone. It was quiet. It was ordinary. And then the ground started to shake. At first she thought it was a truck. Then a lot of trucks. Then she stepped out onto the walkway and looked toward the highway, and what she saw stopped her cold. Motorcycles. A river of them, coming off the interstate in a long dark line, chrome flashing in the sun. Not 2 or 3. Dozens. The sound of them hit the lot like thunder rolling in, and it kept coming, louder and louder, until they turned in through the entrance one after another, and filled that whole dusty lot with rumbling steel. 40 of them. Maybe more. Big men in worn leather vests. And on the back of every single vest, the same patch. A winged skull. The words above it read HELLS Angels. They shut off their engines almost at once, and the silence after all that thunder was somehow worse. 40 men just sitting there, watching the motel. Not moving. Not talking. Just looking at that little strip of 14 rooms like they were reading it. Cody came stumbling out of the office, phone still in his hand, his face gone the color of old cheese. What? What is this? What do you people want? Nobody answered him. Nobody even looked at him. A big man at the front swung off his bike. And Delia's heart stopped because she knew him. It was the man from the shed. Boon. Except he didn't look like a greasy drifter now. He stood straight, that torn-eared shepherd diesel right at his heel, and across the back of his vest, under the winged skull, was a rocker that said Road Captain. He had an oxygen bruise on his cheek and a bandage on his arm, but he walked into that lot like a king coming home. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I have to be honest with you. This is my favorite part of the whole story. And if you've made it this far, if you're the kind of person who believes the quiet ones deserve to win once in a while, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. All right. Back to that lot, where 40 engines had just gone silent and Cody Kessner had started to sweat. Boon Kessler walked right past Cody like he wasn't even there. Cody actually opened his mouth. "Sir, I have to ask you to," and Boon lifted one hand, didn't even turn his head, and Cody's mouth just closed on its own. Boon walked straight to Delia. She was standing by the cart with a rag still in her hand, frozen. He stopped in front of her, this mountain of a man, and for a long moment he just looked at her. Then he did something nobody expected. He got down on one knee in the dirt. In front of her. In front of 40 of his brothers. In front of Cody and every guest peeking through the curtains. "Ma'am," Boon said, and his wrecked voice carried across the whole silent lot. "I've been riding 40 years. I've had brothers pull me out of wrecks. I've had men I'd trust with my life. And yesterday, a woman who weighs $110 walked into a fire that grown men were running from, and she carried me out with her bare hands." He shook his head slow. "I don't have the words for that. But I brought everyone I've got, so they could see the face of the bravest person I ever met." And then, one by one, 40 bikers got off their machines and took off their caps. Delia started to cry. She couldn't help it. I heard the dog," she said. "Anybody would have." "No," Boon said. "They wouldn't. Nobody did. I heard about the folks who stood in their doorways and watched. I heard the laughing." His eyes moved slow across the lot and finally landed on Cody. "I heard about a whole lot of things." Cody tried to smile. It came out sick. "Look, man, we're real glad you're okay. That's great news, real hero stuff. So if you all want to just, take the celebration somewhere else." Boon walked toward him. Slow. Diesel walked with him, and a low growl rolled out of that dog like a diesel engine idling, which, come to think of it, is probably how he got the name. "You're the one Dr. Pay," Boon said. It wasn't a question. That's a private employment matter," Cody stammered, backing up until his shoulders hit the office wall. "She caused property damage. There's a shed. I have to account to my father." "She caused property damage." Boon repeated it quiet, like he was tasting it. "Son, that shed caught fire because your wiring's 40 years old, and you had thinner and rags stacked next to a heat gun somebody left plugged in. I know because I went in there to shut it off after I smelled it cooking. I tried to save your daddy's shed. That's how I ended up on the floor." He leaned down, close to Cody's face. "So the way I count it, this woman saved your building and your guests and your sorry hide, and you took a week's pay off her for the privilege." The whole lot was dead silent. You could hear the wind pushing sand across the pavement. "You want to know the part that gets me?" Boon went on, still quiet. "It ain't that you're lazy. Lots of men are lazy. It's that you had a person working for you with more spine than this whole club combined, and you looked right at her every day and saw a mop. That's not a money problem, son. That's a something missing in you problem." Cody's jaw worked, but nothing came out. "Here's how today's going to go," Boon said, straightening up. "You're going to give her back every dollar you took. Then you're going to add a month's wages on top for the hospital and the burns on her back that I hear you never once asked about." Cody's jaw worked. I don't have that kind of. You've got a lifted truck out back your daddy paid 40 grand for," Boon said. "You've got it." He tilted his head. "And you're going to write her a reference letter. A good one. Because Delia Voss doesn't work here anymore." Delia looked up, startled. "I don't." Boon turned back to her, and his whole face changed. "Gentle now." "Ma'am, that's your call always. But my brother over there," he nodded at a wiry older man by the bikes, "his sister runs a real nice inn up in the hills outside Big Bear. Cool air. Pine trees. Good people. She's been looking for someone to run the housekeeping side. Someone she can trust. Pays double what you make here, and there ain't a single Cody in the building." A few of the men chuckled. "Job's yours if you want it. Nobody's forcing. But you'll never scrub another room for a man who throws soda cans at your feet." Delia's hand went to her mouth. Because he'd heard about that too. Somehow he'd heard about all of it. "How did you?" she started. "Motels talk," Boon said. "Druckers talk. And when somebody hurts one of ours, we listen." He glanced at Cody. "And ma'am, as of yesterday, you're one of ours. That's not a thing that goes away." Cody had gone very quiet against the wall. He was doing math in his head, and every number scared him. Boon snapped his fingers once, and a younger biker came forward with a checkbook, actual paper, and set it on the office counter with a pen. "For the shed," Boon said. "The real repair, not the insurance runaround. Club's covering it. Because your daddy Walt is a decent old man who doesn't deserve to eat the cost of his boy's laziness." He looked at Cody. "Your father, I'd shake his hand. You, I wouldn't cross the street for. Think about the difference. Then he turned his back on Cody completely, which, if you know anything about men like Cody, is the worst thing you can do to them. Made him disappear. Boon walked back to Delia. Behind him, 40 bikers were already moving, and here's the part that got me. They didn't come to tear the place up. They came to build. Half a dozen of them walked to the burned shed and started hauling out the wreckage. 2 more were on the phone ordering lumber from a yard in Barstow. Somebody fired up a generator. One big fellow with a gray ponytail pulled a first aid kit off his bike, walked over to Delia and said, "Ma'am, mind if I take a look at that back?" I was a medic. Those burns need proper dressing, not the gas station kind. They spent the whole day there. In the worst heat of the year, 40 Hells Angels rebuilt Walt Kessner's tool shed from the ground up, better than it was, with new wiring done right. They ordered pizza for the whole lot. They filled the empty pool with a water truck one of them knew a guy with, just because. And every single one of them, at some point, walked over to Delia and shook her hand or tipped their cap and thanked her by name. Not the help. Her name. Delia. She heard it so many times that day, it stopped sounding strange and started sounding like it belonged to her again. Delia Voss, who 2 days earlier had apologized when a man threw a can at her feet, sat in a folding chair in the shade with a cold drink somebody had pressed into her hand and a bandaged back, and a dog named Diesel asleep across her feet, and she watched 40 of the most feared men in America work up a sweat in her honor. She kept waiting for it to feel like a dream. It didn't. It felt, for the first time in a very long time, like being seen. Cody spent the day inside the office with the blinds down. The shed was finished by dusk. Boon walked the length of it, checked the new wiring himself, then came and sat down in the empty chair next to Delia. Diesel lifted his head, thumped his tail twice, and went back to sleep. For a while, neither of them said anything. The sun was going down orange over the flats, and the new lumber smelled clean. "Can I tell you something?" Boon finally said. "When I was down on that floor, I'd already made my peace. I'd stopped fighting it. And then something got hold of me and started pulling. And I remember thinking, whoever this is, they're too small to move me. It's not going to work." He shook his head. "But you didn't stop. You just kept pulling. I couldn't just leave you." Delia said. "I know." Boon said. "That's the whole thing, ma'am. You couldn't. Most people can. Most people did." He looked out at the desert. 40 years I've been trying to figure out what makes a person worth something. It ain't the patch. It ain't the bike. It ain't how big your fists are. He nodded at her. It's whether you keep pulling when it's not going to work. That's it. That's the whole answer. And you had it your whole life, and nobody ever bothered to look. Delia didn't have words for that. So she just sat with it. She took the job in Big Bear. Of course she did. 2 weeks later, 4 of the club rode up to her little rented room, loaded everything she owned into a truck, and escorted her up into the mountains themselves, a small woman in an old sedan flanked by leather and chrome the whole winding way up. The inn was everything Boon said. Pine trees. Cool, clean air. A kind owner named Rosa, who hugged her the first day and meant it. Delia ran the housekeeping side, and she was good at it, and she was paid well for it, and nobody once called her the help. She had her own little cabin behind the main house, and on cold mornings she'd stand on the step with a cup of coffee and watch the mist come off the pines, and she'd think, quietly, that she had never once in 51 years imagined a life this gentle was allowed for someone like her. Boon came through a few times a year, always with diesel, always paying cash, always calling her ma'am. Word had gone out along every road that club rides, and Delia Voss became something close to legend in circles she'd never even see. The maid who walked into the fire. The little one who kept pulling. More than one rough-looking stranger stopped at that inn over the years just to shake her hand. As for the Dry Fork Motel, old Walt Kessner came home, heard the whole story from the guests, and did something Cody never saw coming. He handed the motel over to a manager and cut his son off cold. Last anybody heard, Cody was pumping gas outside Needles, telling a story nobody believed about 40 bikers and a maid, and how none of it was his fault. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. The thing about that whole day. It started the same way it ended. With Delia pulling on something too heavy for her, refusing to let go. In the shed, it was a dying man. Her whole life before that, it had been herself, dragged along day after day, small and quiet and unthanked. She'd been pulling that weight for 51 years, and never once expected anyone to grab the other end. And then one afternoon, she reached for a stranger in the smoke, and 40 men reached back. Nobody laughed at the little maid after that. Not one of them. They took off their caps instead. So the next time you see somebody the world treats like furniture, the quiet one, the invisible one, the one who apologizes when you bump into them, remember Delia Voss. Remember that you have no idea what's inside a person until the fire comes. And remember that the smallest hands in the room are sometimes the only ones still pulling when it counts. Thanks for staying with me on this one. I'll see you on the next.